Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was told by Julio last night that I was doing a Carla by not being my typically outspoken self in the meeting. And I think that really what I've heard over the last couple of days has been encouraging. I've been at meetings around treatment as prevention the last couple of years in Vancouver and in Geneva. And what we've talked about a lot more than at previous meetings has been this cascade of steps that start at testing but go all the way to virological suppression. And I think that's a little bit of a change from some of the things that we've seen in the past, which have been much more about numerators. And in Toronto at the AIDS conference in 2006, the CDC presented data from Botswana that was an impressive curve of increased numbers of people testing, but only numerators and no clear sense of what that meant in terms of linkage to care. And there, over the last couple of years, people in this room and outside of it have made calls for mandatory confidential testing in South Africa tied to applying for driver's licenses. And people have called for testing at Walmart or at Nathan's hot dog stands in the US. And I think we're getting a little bit past some of that silliness and looking at really in a more important question of, what does it mean to get people into this cycle and then keep them in that cycle to get to the real effect that we're trying to get at. So I appreciate Anne's comments to take the gloves off, and I think that's often my role on panels. And while she called for the gloves to come off, I thought her presentation was remarkably polite. And I don't intend to be impolite, but I wanted to recognize that while the cascades that we've seen have been, I think, an important framework and an interesting way of thinking about the problems, we need to also think about the rhetoric to reality on the ground and focus on that much more specifically. So I'm afraid this is smaller text than I thought of because I kept adding barriers. And the intent here wasn't to show this as unicyclical or that each one of these was an essential and necessary step in the cycle, but to identify for different populations where there are human rights abuses within a cascade. And so towards the top, you have denial of HIV prevention and information and services. We've heard about extremely low coverage rates for MSM, extremely low coverage rates for IDU. There's still problems with adolescent girls and adolescent boys getting only abstinence information in certain settings. The next box is denial / mandatory / voluntary HIV testing. Combining the experiences that people have in testing where they can't get testing, they're turned away from testing, or the testing is mandatory. We've heard about that in prison settings. And what the consequence of that might be. Breaches of confidentiality, stigma, discrimination. In South Carolina and the US, there's mandatory testing followed by segregation of HIV-positive prisoners. That can lead to longer prison sentences because you can't earn credits from work release, and so you, because of your HIV status, spend longer in prison. In Asia, in China, and in Vietnam, there are about 400,000 drug users in extrajudicial detention centers, which aren't drug treatment centers, but are closer to forced slave labor camps where they're not getting treatment, they're not getting methadone. They may get antiretroviral treatment, they may not. And a lot of those centers in Vietnam are being activities within the centers are being supported by donor funding, which is essentially allowing the profit maximizing function of those centers to be increased. So that covers arbitrary detention, criminalization we've talked about. I've been frustrated in the last year working in Uganda where there's a draft HIV bill that includes criminalization measures, mandatory testing for pregnant women and their partners, and the lack of enthusiasm by the research community engaged in Uganda and by the donor community to really speak out that this isn't the right approach. And I don't think enough has been done to think about what the consequences of if that law were to pass would be, both in terms of research getting interrupted and having to go back to IRBs and say, what's the consequence of our expanded HIV testing now that people could go to jail for potentially exposing their partners to HIV? What does that mean for women who can't insist upon condom use in that setting or face property rights abuses when their property is taken away from them, when they're kicked out of their homes? A woman that I was doing advocacy with in Uganda said very clearly that when her partner found out that she had HIV, she was not only kicked out of her home, but her diplomas were torn up, and her ability to redress that problem, she was spurned by the police who didn't want to deal with the crime that was committed. And it was striking how the Ugandan government was looking to the criminal justice system to respond to potential HIV exposure, but they were unwilling to use the criminal justice system to respond to domestic violence, to property rights abuses, and gender-based violence. Very, very few rapes are prosecuted in Uganda. Imprisonment is a huge issue. We've worked on HIV and TB in the US in prison settings, also in Uganda and in Zambia. And I was struck last year after our report in Zambia prisons came out. There was a big response. The CDC started doing some TV screening. The Global Fund provided $800,000 to the Zambian prison service for HIV prevention, which is fantastic. The problem is the Zambian prison service, which had formerly had a budget of $40,000 for the entire prison service, didn't know how to spend $800,000. There's no condoms allowed in prisons. Sodomy is illegal. So how do you spend $800,000 on HIV prevention in prisons? Their proposal was trainings for prison guards, which, probably won't get you to $800,000, and putting in place closed circuit TV, which they said would cut down on sexual violence within the prisons. Of course, the prisons are at 400% capacity, and there's no electricity within the cells. So, how they would exactly use this system, which may only be used to extend people's prison terms because they'd be found guilty of violating prohibitions against sodomy, wasn't clear to me. But it strikes at the major issue, which is we need to think beyond the health sector in thinking about treatment as prevention. And we need to engage a wider sector of people to really think about what it means to protect people, to make this cascade from testing to virological suppression really effective. And we saw in Kate's presentation the opening night these three spheres of UNAIDS strategy: prevention, treatment, and human rights and empowerment. And to me, the question is, how much overlap is there between human rights sphere and the treatment and prevention spheres? In the presentation, it only looked like kind of this small amount, which kind of allows us to think, oh, we don't have to really engage human rights that much. And I don't think it's 100%. I don't think the two spheres are exactly on top of each other. But if you saw in Wafa's data that she presented from Mozambique, that 75 out of 100 people fell out of the cascade towards virological suppression, I think you can say that a lot of those 75% were due to these kinds of human rights abuses that lead to denial of treatment or interrupted treatment as people cycle in and out of closed settings, or are kicked out of their homes, or have their medicines taken from them and thrown away by partners. And so I would like to politely invite also other gloves to come off and engagement, but to also reinforce the fact that I do feel like there is progress, and I do feel like there's engagement and momentum and incredible energy at this meeting and in the room, and in the ability of all of us to leave this meeting and really continue to focus on these issues and take them forward. So I would like to just echo one comment made by Stephanie just earlier, which is about doing treatment as treatment better, and that will lead us into doing treatment as prevention better. And I think that's an important underlying thing that we can all agree on and we can all come together for. Thank you.